Section 13 of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier Triumphed in England. Continued. In a week I was to be sent back from Plymouth to St. Malo, but it seemed to me that I might never hear the sequel of the story. And yet it was destined that it should have a sequel, and that I should play a very pleasing and honourable part in it. It was only 3 days after the event which I have described when Lord Rufton burst hurriedly into my room. His face was pale and his manner that of a man in extreme agitation. "Gerard," he cried, "have you seen Lady Jane Dacre?" I had seen her after breakfast, and it was now midday. "By Heaven, there's villainy here!" cried my poor friend, rushing about like a madman. "The bailiff has been up to say that a chaise and pair were seen driving full split down the Tavistock Road. The blacksmith heard a woman scream as it passed his forge. Jane has disappeared. By the Lord, I believe that she has been kidnapped by this villain Dacre." He rang the bell furiously. "Two horses this instant!" he cried. "Colonel Gerard, your pistols. Jane comes back with me this night from Gravel Hanger, or there will be a new master in Highcombe Hall." Behold us, then, within half an hour, like two knight-errants of old, riding forth to the rescue of this lady in distress. It was near Tavistock that Lord Dacre lived, and at every house and toll gate along the road we heard the news of the flying post-chaise in front of us, so there could be no doubt whither they were bound. As we rode, Lord Rufton told me of the man whom we were pursuing. His name, it seems, was a household word throughout all England for every sort of mischief. Wine, women, dice, cards, racing. In all forms of debauchery he had earned for himself a terrible name. He was of an old and noble family, and it had been hoped that he had sowed his wild oats when he married the beautiful Lady Jane Rufton. For some months he had indeed behaved well, and then he had wounded her feelings in their most tender part by some unworthy liaison. She had fled from his house and taken refuge with her brother, from whose care she had now been dragged once more against her will. I ask you if two men could have had a fairer errand than that upon which Lord Rufton and myself were riding. "That's Gravel Hanger," he cried at last, pointing with his crop, and there on the green side of a hill was an old brick and timber building, as beautiful as only an English country house can be. "There's an inn by the park gate, and there we shall leave our horses," he added. For my own part, it seemed to me that with so just a cause we should have done best to ride boldly up to his door and summon him to surrender the lady. But there I was wrong, for the one thing which every Englishman fears is the law. He makes it himself, and when he has once made it, it becomes a terrible tyrant before whom the bravest quails. He will smile at breaking his neck, but he will turn pale at breaking the law. It seems, then, from what Lord Rufton told me as we walked through the park, that we were on the wrong side of the law in this matter. Lord Dacre was in the right in carrying off his wife, since she did indeed belong to him, and our own position now was nothing better than that of burglars and trespassers. It was not for burglars to openly approach the front door. We could take the lady by force or by craft, but we could not take her by right, for the law was against us. This was what my friend explained to me as we crept up toward the shelter of a shrubbery which was close to the windows of the house. Thence we could examine this fortress, see whether we could effect a lodgment in it, and, above all, try to establish some communication with the beautiful prisoner inside. There we were, then, in the shrubbery, Lord Rufton and I, each with a pistol in the pockets of our riding coats, and with the most resolute determination in our hearts that we should not return without the lady. Eagerly we scanned every window of the wide-spread house. Not a sign could we see of the prisoner or of anyone else, but on the gravel drive outside the door were the deep-sunk marks of the wheels of the chaise. There was no doubt that they had arrived. Crouching amongst the laurel bushes, we held a whispered council of wary, but a singular interruption brought it to an end. Out of the door of the house there stepped a tall, flaxen-haired man, such a figure as one would choose for the flank of a grenadier company. As he turned his brown face and his blue eyes towards us I recognized Lord Dacre. With long strides he came down the gravel path straight for the spot where we lay. "Come out, Ned!" he shouted. "You'll have the gamekeeper putting a charge of shot into you. Come out, man, and don't skulk behind the bushes." It was not a very heroic situation for us. My poor friend rose with a crimson face. I sprang to my feet also and bowed with such dignity as I could muster. "Halloa! It's the Frenchman, is it?" said he, without returning my bow. "I've got a crow to pluck with him already. As to you, Ned, I knew you would be hot on our scent, and so I was looking out for you. I saw you cross the park and go to ground in the shrubbery. Come in, man, and let us have all the cards on the table." He seemed master of the situation, this handsome giant of a man, standing at his ease on his own ground, while we slunk out of our hiding place. Lord Rufton had said not a word, but I saw by his darkened brow and his sombre eyes that the storm was gathering. Lord Dacre led the way into the house, and we followed close at his heels. He ushered us himself into an oak-panelled sitting-room, closing the door behind us. Then he looked me up and down with insolent eyes. "Look here, Ned," said he. "Time was when an English family could settle their own affairs in their own way. What has this foreign fellow got to do with your sister and my wife?" "Sir," said I, "permit me to point out to you that this is not a case merely of a sister or a wife, but that I am the friend of the lady in question, and that I have the privilege which every gentleman possesses of protecting a woman against brutality. It is only by a gesture that I can show you what I think of you." I had my riding glove in my hand, and I flicked him across the face with it. He drew back with a bitter smile, and his eyes were as hard as flint. "So you've brought your bully with you, Ned," said he. "You might at least have done your fighting yourself, if it must come to a fight." "So I will," cried Lord Rufton, "here and now." "When I've killed this swaggering Frenchman," said Lord Dacre. He stepped to a side table and opened a brass-bound case. "By Gad!" said he, "either that man or I go out of this room feet foremost. I meant well by you, Ned. I did, by George, but I'll shoot this led captain of yours as sure as my name's George Dacre. Take your choice of pistols, sir, and shoot across this table. The barkers are loaded. Aim straight and kill me if you can, for by the Lord, if you don't, you're done." In vain Lord Rufton tried to take the quarrel upon himself. Two things were clear in my mind. One, that the Lady Jane had feared above all things that her husband and brother should fight. The other, that if I could but kill this big milord, then the whole question would be settled forever in the best way. Lord Rufton did not want him. Lady Jane did not want him. Therefore I, Etienne Gerard, their friend, would pay the debt of gratitude which I owed them by freeing them of this encumbrance. But indeed there was no choice in the matter, for Lord Dacre was as eager to put a bullet into me as I could be to do the same service to him. In vain Lord Rufton argued and scolded. The affair must continue. "Well, if you must fight my guest instead of myself, let it be to-morrow morning, with 2 witnesses," he cried at last. "This is sheer murder across the table." "But it suits my humour, Ned," said Lord Dacre. "And mine, sir," said I. "Then I'll have nothing to do with it," cried Lord Rufton. "I tell you, George, if you shoot Colonel Gerard under these circumstances you'll find yourself in the dock instead of on the bench. I won't act as second, and that's flat." "Sir," said I am perfectly prepared to proceed without a second." "That won't do. It's against the law," cried Lord Dacre. "Come, Ned, don't be a fool. You see we mean to fight. Hang it, man, all I want you to do is drop a handkerchief." "I'll take no part in it." "Then I must find someone who will," said Lord Dacre. He threw a cloth over the pistols which lay upon the table, and he rang the bell. A footman entered. "Ask Colonel Berkeley if he will step this way. You will find him in the billiard room." A moment later there entered a tall, thin Englishman with a great moustache, which was a rare thing amid that clean-shaven race. I have heard since that they were worn only by the Guards and the Hussars. This Colonel Berkeley was a Guardsman. He seemed a strange, tired, languid, drawling creature, with a long black cigar thrusting out like a pole from a bush amidst that immense moustache. He looked from one to the other of us with true English phlegm, and he betrayed not the slightest surprise when he was told our intention. "Quite so," said he. "Quite so." "I refuse to act, Colonel Berkeley," cried Lord Rufton. "Remember, this duel cannot proceed without you, and I hold you personally responsible for anything that happens." This Colonel Berkeley appeared to be an authority upon the question, for he removed the cigar from his mouth and he laid down the law in his strange, drawling voice. "The circumstances are unusual, but not irregular, Lord Rufton," said he. "This gentleman has given a blow, and this other gentleman has received it. That is a clear issue. Time and conditions depend upon the person who demands satisfaction. Very good. He claims it here and now across the table. He is acting within his rights. I am prepared to accept the responsibility." There was nothing more to be said. Lord Rufton sat moodily in the corner, with his brows drawn down and his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his riding breeches. Colonel Berkeley examined the two pistols and laid them both in the centre of the table. Lord Dacre was at one end and I at the other, with 8 feet of shining mahogany between us. On the hearth rug, with his back to the fire, stood the tall colonel, his handkerchief in his left hand, his cigar between 2 fingers of his right. "When I drop the handkerchief," said he, "you will pick up your pistols and you will fire at your own convenience. Are you ready?" "Yes," we cried. His hand opened and the handkerchief fell. I bent swiftly forward and seized a pistol, but the table, as I have said, was 8 feet across, and it was easier for this long-armed milord to reach the pistols than it was for me. I had not yet drawn myself straight before he fired, and to this it was that I owe my life. His bullet would have blown out my brains had I been erect. As it was, it whistled through my curls. At the same instant, just as I threw up my own pistol to fire, the door flew open and a pair of arms were thrown around me. It was the beautiful, flushed, frantic face of Lady Jane which looked up into mine. "You shan't fire, Colonel Gerard. For my sake, don't fire!" she cried. "It is a mistake, I tell you. A mistake, a mistake, a mistake. He is the best and dearest of husbands. Never again shall I leave his side." Her hand slid down my arm and closed upon my pistol. "Jane, Jane!" cried Lord Rufton. "Come with me. You should not be here. Come away." "It is all confoundedly irregular," said Colonel Berkeley. "Colonel Gerard, you won't fire, will you? My heart would break if he were hurt." "Hang it all, Jinny, give the fellow fair play!" cried Lord Dacre. "He stood my fire like a man, and I won't see him interfered with. Whatever happens, I can't get worse than I deserve." But already there had passed between me and the lady a quick glance of the eyes which told her everything. Her hand slipped from my arm. "I leave my husband's life and my own happiness to Colonel Gerard," said she. How well she knew me, this admirable woman! I stood for an instant irresolute, with the pistol cocked in my hand. My antagonist faced me bravely, with no blenching of his sunburnt face and no flinching of his bold blue eyes. "Come, come, sir, take your shot," cried the colonel from the mat. "Let us have it, then," said Lord Dacre. I would at least show them how completely his life was at the mercy of my skill. So much I owed to my own self-respect. I glanced round for a mark. The colonel was looking toward my antagonist, expecting to see him drop. His face was sideways to me, his long cigar projecting from his lips with an inch of ash at the end of it. Quick as a flash I raised my pistol and fired. "Permit me to trim your ash, sir," said I, and I bowed with a grace which is unknown among these islanders. I am convinced that the fault lay with the pistol and not with my own aim. I could hardly believe my own eyes when I saw that I had snapped off the cigar within half an inch of his lips. He stood staring at me with the ragged stub of the cigar end sticking out from his singed moustache. I can see him now with his foolish, angry eyes and his long, thin, puzzled face. Then he began to talk. I have always said that the English are not really a phlegmatic or a taciturn nation if you stir them out of their groove. No one could have talked in a more animated way than this colonel. Lady Jane put her hands over her ears. "Come, come, Colonel Berkeley," said Lord Dacre sternly. "You forget yourself. There's a lady in the room." The colonel gave a stiff bow. "If Lady Dacre will kindly leave the room," said he, "I will be able to tell this infernal little Frenchman what I think of him and his monkey tricks." I was splendid at that moment, for I ignored the words that he had said and remembered only the extreme provocation. "Sir," said I freely offer you my apologies for this unhappy incident. I felt that if I did not discharge my pistol Lord Dacre's honour might feel hurt, and yet it was quite impossible for me, after hearing what this lady has said, to aim it at her husband. I looked round for a mark, therefore, and I had the extreme misfortune to blow your cigar out of your mouth when my intention had merely been to snuff the ash. I was betrayed by my pistol. This is my explanation, sir, and if, after listening to my apologies, you still feel that I owe you satisfaction, I need not say that it is a request which I am unable to refuse." It was certainly a charming attitude which I had assumed, and it won the hearts of all of them. Lord Dacre stepped forward and wrung me by the hand. "By George, sir," said he, "I never thought to feel toward a Frenchman as I do to you. You're a man and a gentleman, and I can't say more." Lord Rufton said nothing, but his hand grip told me all that he thought. Even Colonel Berkeley paid me a compliment and declared that he would think no more about the unfortunate cigar. And she! Ah, if you could have seen the look she gave me, the flushed cheek, the moist eye, the tremulous lip. When I think of my beautiful Lady Jane, it is at that moment that I recall her. They would have had me stay to dinner, but you will understand, my friends, that this was no time for either Lord Rufton or myself to remain at Gravel Hanger. This reconciled couple desired only to be alone. In the chaise he had persuaded her of his sincere repentance, and once again they were a loving husband and wife. If they were to remain so, it was best perhaps that I should go. Why should I unsettle this domestic peace? Even against my own will my mere presence and appearance might have their effect upon the lady. No, no, I must tear myself away. Even her persuasions were unable to make me stop. Years afterward I heard that the household of the Dacres was among the happiest in the whole country, and that no cloud had ever come again to darken their lives. Yet I dare say, if he could have seen into his wife's mind. But there, I say no more. A lady's secret is her own, and I fear that she and it are buried long years ago in some Devonshire churchyard. Perhaps all that gay circle are gone, and the Lady Jane only lives now in the memory of an old half-pay French brigadier. He, at least, can never forget. End of section 13, and end of How the Brigadier Triumphed in England. Of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier Rode to Minsk. I would have a stronger wine tonight, my friends, a wine of Burgundy rather than of Bordeaux. It is that my heart, my old soldier heart, is heavy within me. It is a strange thing, this age which creeps upon one. One does not know, one does not understand. The spirit is ever the same, and one does not remember how the poor body crumbles. But there comes a moment when it is brought home, when quick as the sparkle of a whirling sabre it is clear to us, and we see the men we were and the men we are. Yes, yes, it was so to-day, and I would have a wine of Burgundy to-night, white Burgundy, Montrachet. Sir, I am your debtor. It was this morning in the Champ de Mars. Your pardon, friends, while an old man tells his trouble. You saw the review? Was it not splendid? I was in the enclosure for veteran officers who have been decorated. This ribbon on my breast was my passport. The cross itself I keep at home in a leathern pouch. They did us honour, for we were placed at the saluting point, with the Emperor and the carriages of the court upon our right. It is years since I have been to a review, for I cannot approve of many things which I have seen. I do not approve of the red breeches of the infantry. It was in white breeches that the infantry used to fight. Red is for the cavalry. A little more and they would ask our busbies and our spurs. Had I been seen at a review they might well have said that I, Etienne Gerard, had condoned it. So I have stayed at home. But this war of the Crimea is different. The men go to battle. It is not for me to be absent when brave men gather. My faith, they march well, those light infantrymen. They are not large, but they are very solid, and they carry themselves well. I took off my hat to them as they passed. Then there came the guns. They were good guns, well horsed and well manned. I took off my hat to them. Then came the engineers, and to them also I took off my hat. There are no braver men than the engineers. Then came the cavalry, lancers, cuirassiers, chasseurs, and spahis. To all of them in turn I was able to take off my hat, save only to the spahis. The Emperor had no spahis, but when all of the others had passed, what think you came at the close? A brigade of hussars, and at the charge. Oh, my friends, the pride and the glory and the beauty, the flash and the sparkle, the roar of the hoofs and the jingle of chains, the tossing manes, the noble heads, the rolling cloud, and the dancing waves of steel. My heart drummed to them as they passed. And last of all, was it not my own old regiment? My eyes fell upon the grey and silver dolmans with the leopard skin shabraques, and at that instant the years fell away from me and I saw my own beautiful men and horses, even as they had swept behind their young colonel, in the pride of our youth and our strength, just 40 years ago. Up flew my cane. Chargez! En avant! Vive l'Empereur! It was the past calling to the present. But oh, what a thin, piping voice! Was this the voice that had once thundered from wing to wing of a strong brigade, and the arm that could scarce wave a cane? Were these the muscles of fire and steel which had no match in all Napoleon's mighty host? They smiled at me. They cheered me. The Emperor laughed and bowed. But to me the present was a dim dream, and what was real were my 800 dead hussars and the Etienne of long ago. Enough. A brave man can face age and fate as he faced Cossacks and Uhlans, but there are times when Montrachet is better than the wine of Bordeaux. It is to Russia that they go, and so I will tell you a story of Russia. Ah, what an evil dream of the night it seems! Blood and ice, ice and blood, fierce faces with snow upon the whiskers, blue hands held out for succour, and across the great white plain the one long black line of moving figures, trudging, trudging, 100 miles, another 100, and still always the same white plain. Sometimes there were fir woods to limit it, sometimes it stretched away to the cold blue sky, but the black line stumbled on and on. Those weary, ragged, starving men, the spirit frozen out of them, looked neither to right nor left, but with sunken faces and rounded backs trailed onward and ever onward, making for France as wounded beasts make for their lair. There was no speaking, and you could scarce hear the shuffle of feet in the snow. Only once I heard them laugh. It was outside Wilna, when an aide-de-camp rode up to the head of that dreadful column and asked if that were the Grand Army. All who were within hearing looked round, and when they saw those broken men, those ruined regiments, those fur-capped skeletons who were once the Guard, they laughed, and the laugh crackled down the column like a feu de joie. I have heard many a groan and cry and scream in my life, but nothing so terrible as the laugh of the Grand Army. But why was it that these helpless men were not destroyed by the Russians? Why was it that they were not speared by the Cossacks or herded into droves and driven as prisoners into the heart of Russia? On every side, as you watched the black snake winding over the snow, you saw also dark, moving shadows which came and went like cloud drifts on either flank and behind. They were the Cossacks, who hung round us like wolves round the flock. But the reason why they did not ride in upon us was that all the ice of Russia could not cool the hot hearts of some of our soldiers. To the end there were always those who were ready to throw themselves between these savages and their prey. One man above all rose greater as the danger thickened, and won a higher name amid disaster than he had done when he led our van to victory. To him I drink this glass, to Ney, the red-maned lion, glaring back over his shoulder at the enemy who feared to tread too closely on his heels. I can see him now, his broad white face convulsed with fury, his light blue eyes sparkling like flints, his great voice roaring and crashing amid the roll of the musketry. His glazed and featherless cocked hat was the ensign upon which France rallied during those dreadful days. It is well known that neither I nor the regiment of Hussars of Conflans were at Moscow. We were left behind on the lines of communication at Borodino. How the Emperor could have advanced without us is incomprehensible to me, and indeed it was only then that I understood that his judgment was weakening and that he was no longer the man that he had been. However, a soldier has to obey orders, and so I remained at this village, which was poisoned by the bodies of 30,000 men who had lost their lives in the great battle. I spent the late autumn in getting my horses into condition and reclothing my men, so that when the army fell back on Borodino my hussars were the best of the cavalry and were placed under Ney in the rear guard. What could he have done without us during those dreadful days? "Ah, Gerard," said he one evening, but it is not for me to repeat the words. Suffice it that he spoke what the whole army felt. The rear guard covered the army and the Hussars of Conflans covered the rear guard. There was the whole truth in a sentence. Always the Cossacks were on us, always we held them off. Never a day passed that we had not to wipe our sabres. That was soldiering indeed. But there came a time between Wilna and Smolensk when the situation became impossible. Cossacks and even cold we could fight, but we could not fight hunger as well. Food must be got at all costs. That night Ney sent for me to the waggon in which he slept. His great head was sunk on his hands. Mind and body he was wearied to death. "Colonel Gerard," said he, "things are going very badly with us. The men are starving. We must have food at all costs." "The horses," I suggested. "Save your handful of cavalry. There are none left." "The band," said I. He laughed even in his despair. "Why the band?" he asked. "Fighting men are of value." "Good," said he. "You would play the game down to the last card, and so would I. Good, Gerard, good." He clasped my hand in his. "But there is one chance for us yet, Gerard." He unhooked a lantern from the roof of the waggon and he laid it on a map which was stretched before him. "To the south of us," said he, "there lies the town of Minsk. I have a word from a Russian deserter that much corn has been stored in the town hall. I wish you to take as many men as you think best, set forth for Minsk, seize the corn, load any carts which you may collect in the town, and bring them to me between here and Smolensk. If you fail, it is but a detachment cut off. If you succeed, it is new life to the army." He had not expressed himself well, for it was evident that if we failed it was not merely the loss of a detachment. It is quality as well as quantity which counts. And yet how honourable a mission and how glorious a risk! If mortal man could bring it, then the corn should come from Minsk, I said so, and spoke a few burning words about a brave man's duty, until the Marshal was so moved that he rose and, taking me affectionately by the shoulders, pushed me out of the waggon. It was clear to me that in order to succeed in my enterprise I should take a small force and depend rather upon surprise than upon numbers. A large body could not conceal itself, would have great difficulty in getting food, and would cause all the Russians around us to concentrate for its certain destruction. On the other hand, if a small body of cavalry could get past the Cossacks unseen, it was probable that they would find no troops to oppose them, for we knew that the main Russian army was several days' march behind us. This corn was meant, no doubt, for their consumption. A squadron of Hussars and 30 Polish lancers were all whom I chose for the venture. That very night we rode out of the camp and struck south in the direction of Minsk. Fortunately there was but a half moon, and we were able to pass without being attacked by the enemy. Twice we saw great fires burning amid the snow, and around them a thick bristle of long poles. These were the lances of Cossacks, which they had stood upright while they slept. It would have been a great joy to us to have charged in amongst them, for we had much to revenge, and the eyes of my comrades looked longingly from me to those red flickering patches in the darkness. My faith, I was sorely tempted to do it, for it would have been a good lesson to teach them that they must keep a few miles between themselves and a French army. It is the essence of good generalship, however, to keep one thing before one at a time, and so we rode silently on through the snow, leaving these Cossack bivouacs to right and left. Behind us the black sky was all mottled with a line of flame which showed where our own poor wretches were trying to keep themselves alive for another day of misery and starvation. All night we rode slowly onward, keeping our horses' tails to the pole star. There were many tracks in the snow, and we kept to the line of these, that no one might remark that a body of cavalry had passed that way. These are the little precautions which mark the experienced officer. Besides, by keeping to the tracks we were most likely to find the villages, and only in the villages could we hope to get food. The dawn of day found us in a thick fir wood, the trees so loaded with snow that the light could hardly reach us. When we had found our way out of it, it was full daylight, the rim of the rising sun peeping over the edge of the great snow plain and turning it crimson from end to end. I halted my hussars and lancers under the shadow of the wood, and I studied the country. Close to us there was a small farmhouse. Beyond, at the distance of several miles, was a village. Far away on the skyline rose a considerable town, all bristling with church towers. This must be Minsk. In no direction could I see any sign of troops. It was evident that we had passed through the Cossacks, and that there was nothing between us and our goal. A joyous shout burst from my men when I told them our position, and we advanced rapidly toward the village. I have said, however, that there was a small farmhouse immediately in front of us. As we rode up to it I observed that a fine grey horse with a military saddle was tethered by the door. Instantly I galloped forward, but before I could reach it a man dashed out of the door, flung himself onto the horse, and rode furiously away, the crisp, dry snow flying up in a cloud behind him. The sunlight gleamed upon his gold epaulets, and I knew that he was a Russian officer. He would raise the whole countryside if we did not catch him. I put spurs to Violette and flew after him. My troopers followed, but there was no horse among them to compare with Violette, and I knew well that if I could not catch the Russian I need expect no help from them. But it is a swift horse indeed and a skilful rider who can hope to escape from Violette with Etienne Gerard in the saddle. He rode well, this young Russian, and his mount was a good one, but gradually we wore him down. His face glanced continually over his shoulder, dark, handsome face, with eyes like an eagle, and I saw as I closed with him that he was measuring the distance between us. Suddenly he half turned. There was a flash and a crack as his pistol bullet hummed past my ear. Before he could draw his sword I was upon him, but he still spurred his horse, and the two galloped together over the plain, I with my leg against the Russian's and my left hand upon his right shoulder. I saw his hand fly up to his mouth. Instantly I dragged him across my pommel and seized him by the throat so that he could not swallow. His horse shot from under him, but I held him fast, and Violette came to a stand. Sergeant Oudin of the Hussars was the first to join us. He was an old soldier, and he saw at a glance what I was after. "Hold tight, Colonel," said he. "I'll do the rest." Section 14. Of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier rode to Minsk. Continued. He slipped out his knife, thrust the blade between the clenched teeth of the Russian, and turned it so as to force his mouth open. There on his tongue was the little wad of wet paper which he had been so anxious to swallow. Oudin picked it out, and I let go of the man's throat. From the way in which, half strangled as he was, he glanced at the paper, I was sure that it was a message of extreme importance. His hands twitched as if he longed to snatch it from me. He shrugged his shoulders, however, and smiled good-humouredly when I apologized for my roughness. "And now to business," said I, when he had done coughing and hawking. "What is your name?" "Alexis Barakoff." "Your rank and regiment?" "Captain of the Dragoons of Grodno." "What is this note which you were carrying?" "It is a line which I had written to my sweetheart." "Whose name," said I, examining the address, "is the Hetman Platoff. Come, come, sir, this is an important military document which you are carrying from one general to another. Tell me this instant what it is." "Read it, and then you will know." He spoke perfect French, as do most of the educated Russians, but he knew well that there is not one French officer in 1,000 who knows a word of Russian. The inside of the note contained one single line, which ran like this: "Puść Franzuzi pridut v Minsk Mingotovi." I stared at it, and I had to shake my head. Then I showed it to my Hussars, but they could make nothing of it. The Poles were all rough fellows who could not read or write, save only the sergeant, who came from Memel in East Prussia and knew no Russian. It was maddening, for I felt that I had possession of some important secret upon which the safety of the army might depend, and yet I could make no sense of it. Again I entreated our prisoner to translate it, and offered him his freedom if he would do so. He only smiled at my request. I could not but admire him, for it was the very smile which I should have myself smiled had I been in his position. "At least," said I, "tell us the name of this village." "It is Dobrova." "And that is Minsk over yonder, I suppose?" "Yes, that is Minsk." "Then we shall go to the village, and we shall very soon find someone who will translate this despatch." So we rode onward together, a trooper with his carbine unslung on either side of our prisoner. The village was but a little place, and I set a guard at the ends of the single street so that no one could escape from it. It was necessary to call a halt and to find some food for the men and horses, since they had travelled all night and had a long journey still before them. There was one large stone house in the centre of the village, and to this I rode. It was the house of the priest, a snuffy and ill-favoured old man, who had not a civil answer to any of our questions. An uglier fellow I never met, but my faith it was very different with his only daughter who kept house for him. She was a brunette, a rare thing in Russia, with creamy skin, raven hair, and a pair of the most glorious dark eyes that ever kindled at the sight of a hussar. From the first glance I saw that she was mine. It was no time for love-making when a soldier's duty had to be done, but still, as I took the simple meal which they laid before me, I chatted lightly with the lady, and we were the best of friends before an hour had passed. Sophie was her first name. Her second I never knew. I taught her to call me Etienne, and I tried to cheer her up, for her sweet face was sad, and there were tears in her beautiful dark eyes. I pressed her to tell me what it was which was grieving her. "How can I be otherwise?" said she, speaking French with a most adorable lisp. when one of my poor countrymen is a prisoner in your hands. I saw him between two of your Hussars as you rode into the village." "It is the fortune of war," said I. "His turn to day, mine perhaps to morrow." "But consider, monsieur," said she. "Etienne," said I. "Oh, monsieur!" "Etienne," said I. "Well, then," she cried, beautifully flushed and desperate, "consider, Etienne, that this young officer will be taken back to your army and will be starved or frozen, for if, as I hear, your own soldiers have a hard march, what will be the lot of a prisoner?" I shrugged my shoulders. "You have a kind face, Etienne," said she. "You would not condemn this poor man to certain death. I entreat you to let him go." Her delicate hand rested upon my sleeve. Her dark eyes looked imploringly into mine. A sudden thought passed through my mind. I would grant her request, but I would demand a favour in return. At my order the prisoner was brought up into the room. "Captain Barakoff," said I, "this young lady has begged me to release you, and I am inclined to do so. I would ask you to give your parole that you will remain in this dwelling for 24 hours and take no steps to inform anyone of our movements." "I would do so," said he. "Then I trust in your honour. One man more or less can make no difference in a struggle between great armies, and to take you back as a prisoner would be to condemn you to death. Depart, sir, and show your gratitude not to me, but to the first French officer who falls into your hands." When he was gone I drew my paper from my pocket. "Now, Sophie," said I have done what you asked me, and all that I ask in return is that you will give me a lesson in Russian." "With all my heart," said she. "Let us begin on this," said I, spreading out the paper before her. "Let us take it word for word and see what it means." "It means," said she, "if the French come to Minsk all is lost." Suddenly a look of consternation passed over her beautiful face. "Great heavens!" she cried. "What is it that I have done? I have betrayed my country. Oh, Etienne, your eyes are the last for whom this message is meant. How could you be so cunning as to make a poor, simple-minded, and unsuspecting girl betray the cause of her country?" I consoled my poor Sophie as best I might, and I assured her that it was no reproach to her that she should be outwitted by so old a campaigner and so shrewd a man as myself. Higher they rose and higher, until at last, as the sun sank toward the west, we were in the broad main street and galloped up it amid the shouts of the moujiks and the cries of frightened women until we found ourselves in front of the great town hall. My cavalry I drew up in the square, and I, with my two sergeants, Oudin and Papilette, rushed into the building. Heavens, shall I ever forget the sight which greeted us? Right in front of us was drawn up a triple line of Russian grenadiers. Their muskets rose as we entered, and a crashing volley burst into our very faces. Oudin and Papilette dropped upon the floor riddled with bullets. For myself, my busby was shot away, and I had 2 holes through my dolman. The grenadiers ran at me with their bayonets. "Treason!" I cried. "We are betrayed! Stand to your horses!" I rushed out of the hall, but the whole square was swarming with troops. From every side street dragoons and Cossacks were riding down upon us, and such a rolling fire had burst from the surrounding houses that half my men and horses were on the ground. "Follow me!" I yelled, and sprang upon Violette, but a giant of a Russian dragoon officer threw his arms round me, and we rolled on the ground together. He shortened his sword to kill me, but changing his mind he seized me by the throat and banged my head against the stones until I was unconscious. So it was that I became the prisoner of the Russians. When I came to myself my only regret was that my captor had not beaten out my brains. There in the grand square of Minsk lay half my troopers, dead or wounded, with exultant crowds of Russians gathered around them. The rest, in a melancholy group, were herded into the porch of the town hall, a sotnia of Cossacks keeping guard over them. Alas, what could I say? What could I do? It was evident that I had led my men into a carefully baited trap. They had heard of our mission and they had prepared for us. And yet there was that dispatch which had caused me to neglect all precautions and to ride straight into the town. How was I to account for that? The tears ran down my cheeks as I surveyed the ruin of my squadron and as I thought of the plight of my comrades of the Grand Army who awaited the food which I was to have brought them. Ney had trusted me and I had failed him. How often he would strain his eyes over the snow fields for that convoy of grain which should never gladden his sight. My own fate was hard enough. An exile in Siberia was the best which the future could bring me. But you will believe me, my friends, it was not for his own sake, but for that of his starving comrades, that Etienne Gerard's cheeks were lined by his tears, frozen even as they were shed. "What's this?" said a gruff voice at my elbow, and I turned to face the huge black-bearded dragoon who had dragged me from my saddle. "Look at the Frenchman crying! I thought that the Corsican was followed by brave men, not by children." "If you and I were face to face and alone, I should let you see which is the better man," said I. For answer the brute struck me across the face with his open hand. I seized him by the throat, but a dozen of his soldiers tore me away from him, and he struck me again while they held my hands. "You base hound!" I cried. "Is this the way to treat an officer and a gentleman?" "We never asked you to come to Russia," said he. "If you do you must take such treatment as you can get. I would shoot you off hand if I had my way." "You will answer for this some day," I cried as I wiped the blood from my moustache. "If the Hetman Platoff is of my way of thinking you will not be alive this time to-morrow," he answered with a ferocious scowl. He added some words in Russian to his troops, and instantly they all sprang to their saddles. Poor Violette, looking as miserable as her master, was led round and I was told to mount her. My left arm was tied with a thong which was fastened to the stirrup iron of a sergeant of dragoons. So, in most sorry plight, I and the remnant of my men set forth from Minsk. Never have I met such a brute as this man Sergine, who commanded the escort. The Russian army contains the best and the worst in the world, but a worse than Major Sergine of the Dragoons of Kiev I have never seen in any force outside of the guerillas of the Peninsula. He was a man of great stature, with a fierce, hard face and a bristling black beard which fell over his cuirass. I have been told since that he was noted for his strength and his bravery, and I could answer for it that he had the grip of a bear, for I had felt it when he tore me from my saddle. He was a wit, too, in his way, and made continual remarks in Russian at our expense, which set all his dragoons and Cossacks laughing. Twice he beat my comrades with his riding whip, and once he approached me with the lash swung over his shoulder, but there was something in my eyes which prevented it from falling. So, in misery and humiliation, cold and starving, we rode in a disconsolate column across the vast snow plain. The sun had sunk, but still in the long northern twilight we pursued our weary journey. Numbed and frozen, with my head aching from the blows it had received, I was borne onward by Violette, hardly conscious of where I was or whither I was going. The little mare walked with a sunken head, only raising it to snort her contempt for the mangy Cossack ponies who were around her. But suddenly the escort stopped, and I found that we had halted in the single street of a small Russian village. There was a church on one side, and on the other was a large stone house, the outline of which seemed to me to be familiar. I looked around me in the twilight, and then I saw that we had been led back to Dobrova, and that this house, at the door of which we were waiting, was the same house of the priest at which we had stopped in the morning. Here it was that my charming Sophie, in her innocence, had translated the unlucky message which had in some strange way led us to our ruin. To think that only a few hours before we had left this very spot with such high hopes and all fair prospects for our mission, and now the remnants of us waited as beaten and humiliated men for whatever lot a brutal enemy might ordain. But such is the fate of the soldier, my friends. Kisses today, blows tomorrow. Tokay in a palace, ditch-water in a hovel. Furs or rags, a full purse or an empty pocket, ever swaying from the best to the worst, with only his courage and his honour unchanging. End of section 15. Of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier rode to Minsk. Continued. The Russian horsemen dismounted, and my poor fellows were ordered to do the same. It was already late, and it was clearly their intention to spend the night in this village. There were great cheering and joy amongst the peasants when they understood that we had all been taken, and they flocked out of their houses with flaming torches, the women carrying out tea and brandy for the Cossacks. Amongst others the old priest came forth, the same whom we had seen in the morning. He was all smiles now, and he bore with him some hot punch on a salver, the reek of which I can remember still. Behind her father was Sophie. With horror I saw her clasp Major Sergein's hand as she congratulated him upon the victory he had won and the prisoners he had made. The old priest, her father, looked at me with an insolent face and made insulting remarks at my expense, pointing at me with his lean and grimy hand. His fair daughter Sophie looked at me also, but she said nothing, and I could read her tender pity in her dark eyes. At last she turned to Major Sergei and said something to him in Russian, on which he frowned and shook his head impatiently. She appeared to plead with him, standing there in the flood of light which shone from the open door of her father's house. My eyes were fixed upon the two faces, that of the beautiful girl and of the dark, fierce man, for my instinct told me that it was my own fate which was under debate. For a long time the soldier shook his head, and then, at last softening before her pleadings, he appeared to give way. He turned to where I stood with my guardian sergeant beside me. "These good people offer you the shelter of their roof for the night," said he to me, looking me up and down with vindictive eyes. "I find it hard to refuse them, but I tell you straight that for my part I had rather see you on the snow. It would cool your hot blood, you rascal of a Frenchman." I looked at him with a contempt that I felt. "You were born a savage and you will die one," said I. My words stung him, for he broke into an oath, raising his whip as if he would strike me. "Silence, you crop-eared dog!" he cried. "Had I my way, some of the insolence would be frozen out of you before morning." Mastering his passion, he turned upon Sophie with what he meant to be a gallant manner. "If you have a cellar with a good lock," said he, "the fellow may lie in it for the night. Since you have done him the honour to take an interest in his comfort, I must have his parole that he will not attempt to play us any tricks, as I am answerable for him until I hand him over to the Hetman Platoff to-morrow." His supercilious manner was more than I could endure. He had evidently spoken French to the lady in order that I might understand the humiliating way in which he referred to me. "I will take no favour from you," said I. "You may do what you like, but I will never give you my parole." The Russian shrugged his great shoulders and turned away as if the matter were ended. "Very well, my fine fellow. So much the worse for your fingers and toes. We shall see how you are in the morning after a night in the snow." "One moment, Major Sergei," cried Sophie. "You must not be so hard upon this prisoner. There are some special reasons why he has a claim upon our kindness and mercy." The Russian looked with suspicion upon his face from her to me. "What are the special reasons? You certainly seem to take a remarkable interest in this Frenchman," said he. "The chief reason is that he has this very morning, of his own accord, released Captain Alexis Barakoff of the Dragoons of Grodno." "It is true," said Barakoff, who had come out of the house. "He captured me this morning, and he released me upon parole rather than take me back to the French army, where I should have been starved." "Since Colonel Gerard has acted so generously, You will surely, now that fortune has changed, allow us to offer him the poor shelter of our cellar upon this bitter night," said Sophie. "It is a small return for his generosity." But the Dragoon was still in the sulks. "Let him give me his parole first that he will not attempt to escape," said he. "Do you hear, sir? Do you give me your parole?" "I give you nothing," said I. "Colonel Gerard," cried Sophie, turning to me with a coaxing smile, "you will give me your parole, will you not?" "To you, mademoiselle, I can refuse nothing. I will give you my parole with pleasure." "There, Major Sergine," cried Sophie in triumph. "That is surely sufficient. You have heard him say that he gives me his parole. I will be answerable for his safety." In an ungracious fashion my Russian bear grunted his consent, and so I was led into the house, followed by the scowling father and by the big, black bearded Dragoon. In the basement there was a large and roomy chamber where the winter logs were stored. Thither it was that I was led, and I was given to understand that this was to be my lodging for the night. One side of this bleak apartment was heaped up to the ceiling with fagots of firewood. The rest of the room was stone flagged and bare walled, with a single deep set window upon one side, which was safely guarded with iron bars. For light I had a large stable lantern, which swung from a beam of the low ceiling. Major Sergine smiled as he took this down and swung it round so as to throw its light into every corner of that dreary chamber. "How do you like our Russian hotels, monsieur?" he asked with his hateful sneer. "They are not very grand, but they are the best that we can give you. Perhaps the next time that you Frenchmen take a fancy to travel you will choose some other country where they will make you more comfortable." He stood laughing at me, his white teeth gleaming through his beard. Then he left me, and I heard the great key creak in the lock. For an hour of utter misery, chilled in body and soul, I sat upon a pile of fagots, my face sunk upon my hands and my mind full of the saddest thoughts. It was cold enough within those four walls, but I thought of the sufferings of my poor troopers outside, and I sorrowed with their sorrow. Then I paced up and down, and I clapped my hands together and kicked my feet against the walls to keep them from being frozen. The lamp gave out some warmth, but still it was bitterly cold, and I had had no food since morning. It seemed to me that everyone had forgotten me, but at last I heard the key turn in the lock, and who should enter but my prisoner of the morning, Captain Alexis Barakoff. A bottle of wine projected from under his arm, and he carried a great plate of hot stew in front of him. "Hush!" said he. "Not a word. Keep up your heart. I cannot stop to explain, for Sergine is still with us. Keep awake and ready." With these hurried words he laid down the welcome food and ran out of the room. Keep awake and ready. The words rang in my ears. I ate my food and I drank my wine. But it was neither food nor wine which had warmed the heart within me. What could those words of Barakoff mean? Why was I to remain awake? For what was I to be ready? Was it possible that there was a chance yet of escape? I have never respected the man who neglects his prayers at all other times and yet prays when he is in peril. It is like a bad soldier who pays no respect to the colonel save when he would demand a favour of him. And yet when I thought of the salt mines of Siberia on the one side and of my mother in France upon the other, I could not help a prayer rising, not from my lips but from my heart, that the words of Barakoff might mean all that I hoped. But hour after hour struck upon the village clock, and still I heard nothing save the call of the Russian sentries in the street outside. Then at last my heart leaped within me, for I heard a light step in the passage. An instant later the key turned, the door opened, and Sophie was in the room. "Monsieur!" she cried. "Etienne!" said I. "Nothing will change you," said she. "But is it possible that you do not hate me? Have you forgiven me the trick which I played you?" "What trick?" I asked. "Good heavens! Is it possible that even now you have not understood it? You have asked me to translate the dispatch. I have told you that it meant if the French come to Minsk all is lost." What did it mean, then? It means, let the French come to Minsk. We are awaiting them. I sprang back from her. You betrayed me, I cried. You lured me into this trap. It is to you that I owe the death and capture of my men. Fool that I was to trust a woman. Do not be unjust, Colonel Gerard. I am a Russian woman, and my first duty is to my country. Would you not wish a French girl to have acted as I have done? Had I translated the message correctly, you would not have gone to Minsk, and your squadron would have escaped. Tell me that you forgive me." She looked bewitching as she stood pleading her cause in front of me, and yet as I thought of my dead men I could not take the hand which she held out to me. "Very good," said she, as she dropped it by her side. "You feel for your own people and I feel for mine, and so we are equal. But you have said one wise and kindly thing within these walls, Colonel Gerard. You have said one man more or less can make no difference in a struggle between two great armies. Your lesson of nobility is not wasted. Behind those fagots is an unguarded door. Here is the key to it. Go forth, Colonel Gerard, and I trust that we may never look upon each other's faces again." I stood for an instant with the key in my hand and my head in a whirl. Then I handed it back to her. "I cannot do it," I said. "Why not?" "I have given my parole." "To whom?" she asked. "Why, to you." "And I release you from it." My heart bounded with joy. Of course, it was true what she said. I had refused to give my parole to Sergine. I owed him no duty. If she relieved me from my promise my honour was clear. I took the key from her hand. "You will find Captain Barakoff at the end of the village street," said she. "We of the North never forget either an injury or a kindness. He has your mare and your sword waiting for you. Do not delay an instant, for in 2 hours it will be dawn." So I passed out into the starlit Russian night and had that last glimpse of Sophie as she peered after me through the open door. She looked wistfully at me as if she expected something more than the cold thanks which I gave her. But even the humblest man has his pride, and I will not deny that mine was hurt by the deception which she had played upon me. I could not have brought myself to kiss her hand, far less her lips. The door led into a narrow alley, and at the end of it stood a muffled figure who held Violette by the bridle. "You told me to be kind to the next French officer whom I found in distress," said he. "Good luck, bon voyage," he whispered as I bounded into the saddle. "Remember, Poltava is the watchword." It was well that he had given it to me, for twice I had to pass Cossack pickets before I was clear of the lines. I had just ridden past the last vedettes and hoped that I was a free man again when there was a soft thudding in the snow behind me, and a heavy man upon a great black horse came swiftly after me. My first impulse was to put spurs to Violette. My second, as I saw a long black beard against a steel cuirass, was to halt and await him. "I thought it was you, you dog of a Frenchman!" he cried, shaking his drawn sword at me. "So you have broken your parole, you rascal!" "I gave no parole." "You lie, you hound!" I looked around and no one was coming. The vedettes were motionless and distant. We were all alone, with the moon above and the snow beneath. Fortune has ever been my friend. "I gave you no parole." "You gave it to the lady." "Then I will answer for it to the lady." "That would suit you better, no doubt. But unfortunately you will have to answer for it to me." "I am ready." "Your sword, too. There is treason in this. I see it all. The woman has helped you. She shall see Siberia for this night's work." The words were his death warrant. For Sophie's sake I could not let him go back alive. Our blades crossed, and an instant later mine was through his black beard and deep in his throat. I was on the ground almost as soon as he, but the one thrust was enough. He died, snapping his teeth at my ankles like a savage wolf. 2 days later I had rejoined the army at Smolensk, and was a part once more of that dreary procession which tramped onward through the snow, leaving a long wheal of blood to show the path which it had taken. Enough, my friends. I would not reawaken the memory of those days of misery and death. They still come to haunt me in my dreams. When we halted at last in Warsaw, we had left behind us our guns, our transport, and three-fourths of our comrades. But we did not leave behind us the honour of Etienne Gerard. They have said that I broke my parole. Let them beware how they say it to my face, for the story is as I tell it, and old as I am, my forefinger is not too weak to press a trigger when my honour is in question. End of section 16, and end of How the Brigadier Rode to Minsk. Section 17 of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier bore himself at Waterloo. The story of the Forest Inn. Of all the great battles in which I had the honour of drawing my sword for the Emperor and for France, there was not one which was lost. At Waterloo, although in a sense I was present, I was unable to fight, and the enemy was victorious. It is not for me to say that there is a connection between these two things. You know me too well, my friends, to imagine that I would make such a claim. But it gives matter for thought, and some have drawn flattering conclusions from it. After all, it was only a matter of breaking a few English squares, and the day would have been our own. If the Hussars of Conflans, with Etienne Gerard to lead them, could not do this, then the best judges are mistaken. But let that pass. The fates had ordained that I should hold my hand, and that the Emperor should fall. But they had also ordained that this day of gloom and sorrow should bring such honour to me as had never come when I swept on the wings of victory from Boulogne to Vienna. Never had I burned so brilliantly as at that supreme moment when the darkness fell upon all around me. You are aware that I was faithful to the Emperor in his adversity, and that I refused to sell my sword and my honour to the Bourbons. Never again was I to feel my war horse between my knees, never again to hear the kettle drums and silver trumpets behind me as I rode in front of my little rascals. But it comforts my heart, my friends, and it brings the tears to my eyes to think how great I was upon that last day of my soldier life, and to remember that of all the remarkable exploits which have won me the love of so many beautiful women and the respect of so many noble men, that there was none which, in splendour, in audacity, and in the great end which was attained, could compare with my famous ride upon the night of June 18th, 1815. I am aware that the story is often told at mess tables and in barrack rooms, so that there are few in the army who have not heard it, but modesty has sealed my lips until now, my friends. In the privacy of these intimate gatherings I am inclined to lay the true facts before you. In the first place, there is one thing which I can assure you. In all his career Napoleon never had so splendid an army as that with which he took the field for that campaign. In 1813 France was exhausted. For every veteran there were 5 children, Marie Louises, as we called them, for the Empress had busied herself in raising levies while the Emperor took the field. But it was very different in 1815. The prisoners had all come back, the men from the snows of Russia, the men from the dungeons of Spain, the men from the hulks in England. These were the dangerous men, veterans of 20 battles, longing for their old trade and with hearts filled with hatred and revenge. The ranks were full of soldiers who wore 2 and 3 chevrons, every chevron meaning 5 years' service. And the spirit of these men was terrible. They were raging, furious, fanatical, adoring the Emperor as a Mameluke does his prophet, ready to fall upon their own bayonets if their blood could serve him. If you had seen these fierce old veterans going into battle with their flushed faces, their savage eyes, their furious yells, you would wonder that anything could stand against them. So high was the spirit of France at that time that every other spirit would have quailed before it. But these people, these English, had neither spirit nor soul, but only solid, immovable beef, against which we broke ourselves in vain. That was it, my friends. On the one side, poetry, gallantry, self-sacrifice, all that is beautiful and heroic. On the other side, beef. Our hopes, our ideals, our dreams, all were shattered on that terrible beef of old England. You have read how the Emperor gathered his forces, and then how he and I, with 130,000 veterans, hurried to the northern frontier and fell upon the Prussians and the English. On the 16th of June Ney held the English in play at Quatre Bras, while we beat the Prussians at Ligny. It is not for me to say how far I contributed to that victory, but it is well known that the Hussars of Conflans covered themselves with glory. They fought well, these Prussians, and 8,000 of them were left upon the field. The Emperor thought that he had done with them, as he sent Marshal Grouchy with 32,000 men to follow them up and to prevent their interfering with his plans. Then, with nearly 80,000 men, he turned upon those goddam Englishmen. How much we had to avenge upon them, we Frenchmen, the guineas of Pitt, the hulks of Portsmouth, the invasion of Wellington, the perfidious victories of Nelson. At last the day of punishment seemed to have arisen. Wellington had with him 67,000 men, but many of them were known to be Dutch and Belgian, who had no great desire to fight against us. Of good troops he had not 50,000. Finding himself in the presence of the Emperor in person with 80,000 men, this Englishman was so paralysed with fear that he could neither move himself nor his army. You have seen the rabbit when the snake approaches. So stood the English upon the ridge of Waterloo. The night before, the Emperor, who had lost an aide-de-camp at Ligny, ordered me to join his staff, and I had left my Hussars to the charge of Major Victor. I know not which of us was the most grieved, they or I, that I should be called away upon the eve of battle, but an order is an order, and a good soldier can but shrug his shoulders and obey. With the Emperor I rode across the front of the enemy's position on the morning of the 18th, he looking at them through his glass and planning which was the shortest way to destroy them. Soult was at his elbow, and Ney and Foy, and others who had fought the English in Portugal and Spain. "Have a care, sire," said Soult. "The English infantry is very solid." "You think them good soldiers because they have beaten you," said the Emperor, and we younger men turned away our faces and smiled. But Ney and Foy were grave and serious. All the time the English line, chequered with red and blue and dotted with batteries, was drawn up silent and watchful within a long musket shot of us. On the other side of the shallow valley our own people, having finished their soup, were assembling for the battle. It had rained very heavily, but at this moment the sun shone out and beat upon the French army, turning our brigades of cavalry into so many dazzling rivers of steel, and twinkling and sparkling on the innumerable bayonets of the infantry. At the sight of that splendid army and the beauty and majesty of its appearance, I could contain myself no longer, but rising in my stirrups I waved my busby and cried, "Vive l'Empereur!" a shout which growled and roared and clattered from one end of the line to the other, while the horsemen waved their swords and the footmen held up their shakos upon their bayonets. The English remained petrified upon their ridge. They knew that their hour had come. And so it would have come if at that moment the word had been given and the whole army had been permitted to advance. We had but to fall upon them and to sweep them from the face of the earth. To put aside all question of courage, we were the more numerous, the older soldiers, and the better led. But the Emperor desired to do all things in order, and he waited until the ground should be drier and harder, so that his artillery could manoeuvre. So 3 hours were wasted, and it was 11 o'clock before we saw Jerome Bonaparte's columns advance upon our left and heard the crash of the guns, which told that the battle had begun. The loss of those 3 hours was our destruction. The attack upon the left was directed upon a farmhouse which was held by the English Guards, and we heard the three loud shouts of apprehension which the defenders were compelled to utter. They were still holding out, and d'Erlon's corps was advancing upon the right to engage another portion of the English line, when our attention was called away from the battle beneath our noses to a distant portion of the field of action. The Emperor had been looking through his glass to the extreme left of the English line, and now he turned suddenly to the Duke of Dalmatia, or Soult, as we soldiers preferred to call him. "What is it, Marshal?" said he. We all followed the direction of his gaze, some raising our glasses, some shading our eyes. There was a thick wood over yonder, then a long bare slope and another wood beyond. Over this bare strip, between the two woods, there lay something dark, like the shadow of a moving cloud. "I think that they are cattle, sire," said Soult. At that instant there came a quick twinkle from amid the dark shadow. "It is Grouchy," said the Emperor, and he lowered his glass. "They are doubly lost, these English. I hold them in the hollow of my hand. They cannot escape me." He looked round, and his eyes fell upon me. "Ah, here is the Prince of Messengers," said he. "Are you well mounted, Colonel Gerard?" I was riding my little Violette, the pride of the brigade. I said so. "Then ride hard to Marshal Grouchy, whose troops you see over yonder. Tell him that he is to fall upon the left flank and rear of the English, while I attack them in front. Together we should crush them, and not a man escape." I saluted and rode off without a word, my heart dancing with joy that such a mission should be mine. I looked at that long, solid line of red and blue looming through the smoke of the guns, and I shook my fist at it as I went. "We shall crush them, and not a man escape." They were the Emperor's words, and it was I, Etienne Gerard, who was to turn them into deeds. I burned to reach the Marshal, and for an instant I thought of riding through the English left wing as being the shortest cut. I have done bolder deeds and come out safely, but I reflected that if things went badly with me and I was taken or shot, the message would be lost and the plans of the Emperor miscarry. I passed in front of the cavalry, therefore, past the chasseurs, the lancers of the guard, the carabineers, the horse grenadiers, and lastly my own little rascals, who followed me wistfully with their eyes. Beyond the cavalry the old guard was standing, 12 regiments of them, all veterans of many battles, sombre and severe, in long blue overcoats and high bearskins from which the plumes had been removed. Each bore within the goatskin knapsack upon his back the blue and white parade uniform which they would use for their entry into Brussels next day. As I rode past them I reflected that these men had never been beaten, and as I looked at their weather-beaten faces and their stern and silent bearing I said to myself that they never would be beaten. Great heavens, how little could I foresee what a few more hours would bring! On the right of the Old Guard were the Young Guard and the 6th Corps of Lobau, and then I passed Jacquinot's Lancers and Marbot's Hussars, who held the extreme flank of the line. All these troops knew nothing of the corps which was coming toward them through the wood, and their attention was taken up in watching the battle which raged upon their left. More than 100 guns were thundering from each side, and the din was so great that of all the battles which I have fought I cannot recall more than half a dozen which were as noisy. I looked back over my shoulder, and there were 2 brigades of cuirassiers, English and French, pouring down the hill together, with the sword blades playing over them like summer lightning. How I longed to turn Violette and to lead my Hussars into the thick of it! What a picture! Etienne Gerard with his back to the battle and a fine cavalry action raging behind him. But duty is duty, so I rode past Marbot's vedettes and on in the direction of the wood, passing the village of Frischemont upon my left. In front of me lay the great wood called the Wood of Paris, consisting mostly of oak trees, with a few narrow paths leading through it. I halted and listened when I reached it, but out of its gloomy depths there came no blare of trumpet, no murmur of wheels, no tramp of horses to mark the advance of that great column which, with my own eyes, I had seen streaming toward it. The battle roared behind me, but in front all was as silent as that grave in which so many brave men would shortly sleep. The sunlight was cut off by the arches of leaves above my head, and a heavy, damp smell rose from the sodden ground. For several miles I galloped at such a pace as few riders would care to go, with roots below and branches above. Then, at last, for the first time, I caught a glimpse of Grouchy's advance guard. Scattered parties of Hussars passed me on either side, but some distance off among the trees. I heard the beating of a drum far away, and the low, dull murmur which an army makes upon the march. Any moment I might come upon the staff and deliver my message to Grouchy in person, for I knew well that on such a march a Marshal of France would certainly ride with the van of his army. Suddenly the trees thinned in front of me, and I understood with delight that I was coming to the end of the wood, whence I could see the army and find the Marshal. End of section 17. Of the Adventures of Gerard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How the Brigadier bore himself at Waterloo. The story of the Forest Inn. Continued. Where the track comes out from amid the trees there is a small cabaret where woodcutters and waggoners drink their wine. Outside the door of this I reined up my horse for an instant while I took in the scene which was before me. Some few miles away I saw a second great forest, that of St. Lambert, out of which the Emperor had seen the troops advancing. It was easy to see, however, why there had been so long a delay in their leaving one wood and reaching the other, because between the two ran the deep defile of the Lanais, which had to be crossed. Sure enough, a long column of troops, horse, foot, and guns, was streaming down one side of it and swarming up the other, while the advance guard was already among the trees on either side of me. A battery of horse artillery was coming along the road, and I was about to gallop up to it and ask the officer in command if he could tell me where I should find the Marshal, when suddenly I observed that, though the gunners were dressed in blue, they had not the dolman trimmed with red Brandenburgs as our own horse gunners wear it. Amazed at the sight, I was looking at these soldiers to left and right when a hand touched my thigh, and there was the landlord, who had rushed from his inn. "Madman!" he cried. "Why are you here? What are you doing?" "I am seeking Marshal Grouchy." "You are in the heart of the Prussian army. Turn and fly." "Impossible. This is Grouchy's corps." "How do you know?" "Because the Emperor has said it." "Then the Emperor has made a terrible mistake. I tell you that a patrol of Silesian Hussars has this instant left me. Did you not see them in the wood?" "I saw Hussars." "They are the enemy." "Where is Grouchy?" "He is behind. They have passed him." "Then how can I go back? If I go forward I may see him yet. I must obey my orders and find him wherever he is." The man reflected for an instant. "Quick, quick!" he cried, seizing my bridle. "Do what I say, and you may yet escape. They have not observed you yet. Come with me, and I will hide you until they pass." Behind his house there was a low stable, and into this he thrust Violette. Then he half led and half dragged me into the kitchen of the inn. It was a bare, brick-floored room. A stout, red-faced woman was cooking cutlets at the fire. "What's the matter now?" she asked, looking with a frown from me to the innkeeper. "Who is this you've brought in?" "It is a French officer, Marie. We cannot let the Prussians take him." "Why not?" "Why not? Sacred name of a dog! Was I not myself a soldier of Napoleon? Did I not win a musket of honour among the Velites of Guard? Shall I see a comrade taken before my eyes? Marie, we must save him." But the lady looked at me with most unfriendly eyes. "Pierre Charras," she said, You will not rest until you have your house burned over your head. Do you not understand, you blockhead, that if you fought for Napoleon it was because Napoleon ruled Belgium? He does so no longer. The Prussians are our allies, and this is our enemy. I will have no Frenchman in this house. Give him up." The innkeeper scratched his head and looked at me in despair, but it was very evident to me that it was neither for France nor for Belgium that this woman cared, but that it was the safety of her own house that was nearest her heart. "Madame," said I, with all the dignity and assurance I could command, "the Emperor is defeating the English, and the French army will be here before evening. If you have used me well you will be rewarded, and if you have denounced me you will be punished, and your house will certainly be burned by the provost marshal." She was shaken by this, and I hastened to complete my victory by other methods. "Surely," said I, "it is impossible that anyone so beautiful can also be hard-hearted. You will not refuse me the refuge which I need?" She looked at my whiskers, and I saw that she was softened. I took her hand, and in 2 minutes we were on such terms that her husband swore roundly that he would give me up himself if I pressed the matter farther. "Besides, the road is full of Prussians," he cried. "Quick, quick, into the loft!" "Quick, quick, into the loft!" echoed his wife, and together they hurried me toward a ladder which led to a trap door in the ceiling. There was loud knocking at the door, so you can think that it was not long before my spurs went twinkling through the hole and the board was dropped behind me. An instant later I heard the voices of the Germans in the rooms below me. The place in which I found myself was a single long attic, the ceiling of which was formed by the roof of the house. It ran over the whole of one side of the inn, and through the cracks in the flooring I could look down either upon the kitchen, the sitting room, or the bar, at my pleasure. There were no windows, but the place was in the last stage of disrepair, and several missing slates upon the roof gave me light and the means of observation. The place was heaped with lumber fodder at one end and a huge pile of empty bottles at the other. There was no door or window save the hole through which I had come up. I sat upon the heap of hay for a few minutes to steady myself and to think out my plans. It was very serious that the Prussians should arrive upon the field of battle earlier than our reserves. But there appeared to be only one corps of them, and a corps more or less makes little difference to such a man as the Emperor. He could afford to give the English all this and beat them still. The best way in which I could serve him, since Grouchy was behind, was to wait here until they were past, and then to resume my journey, to see the Marshal, and to give him his orders. If he advanced upon the rear of the English instead of following the Prussians, all would be well. The fate of France depended upon my judgment and my nerve. It was not the first time, my friends, as you are well aware, and you know the reasons that I had to trust that neither nerve nor judgment would ever fail me. Certainly the Emperor had chosen the right man for his mission. The Prince of Messengers he had called me. I would earn my title. It was clear that I could do nothing until the Prussians had passed, so I spent my time in observing them. I have no love for these people, but I am compelled to say that they kept excellent discipline, for not a man of them entered the inn, though their lips were caked with dust and they were ready to drop with fatigue. Those who had knocked at the door were bearing an insensible comrade, and having left him they returned at once to the ranks. Several others were carried in the same fashion and laid in the kitchen, while a young surgeon, little more than a boy, remained behind in charge of them. Having observed them through the cracks in the floor, I next turned my attention to the holes in the roof, from which I had an excellent view of all that was passing outside. The Prussian corps was still streaming past. It was easy to see that they had made a terrible march and had little food, for the faces of the men were ghastly, and they were plastered from head to foot with mud from their falls upon the foul and slippery roads. Yet, spent as they were, their spirit was excellent, and they pushed and hauled at the gun carriages when the wheels sank up to the axles in the mire, and the weary horses were floundering knee deep, unable to draw them through. The officers rode up and down the column, encouraging the more active with words of praise and the laggards with blows from the flat of their swords. All the time from over the wood in front of them there came the tremendous roar of the battle, as if all the rivers on earth had united in one gigantic cataract, booming and crashing in a mighty fall. Like the spray of the cataract was the long veil of smoke which rose high over the trees. The officers pointed to it with their swords, and with hoarse cries from their parched lips the mud-stained men pushed onward to the battle. For an hour I watched them pass, and I reflected that their vanguard must have come into touch with Marbot's vedettes, and that the Emperor knew already of their coming. "You are going very fast up the road, my friends, but you will come down it a great deal faster," said I to myself, and I consoled myself with the thought. But an adventure came to break the monotony of this long wait. I was seated beside my loophole and congratulating myself that the corps was nearly past and that the road would soon be clear for my journey, when suddenly I heard a loud altercation break out in French in the kitchen. "You shall not go!" cried a woman's voice. "I tell you that I will," said a man's, and there was a sound of scuffling. In an instant I had my eye to the crack in the floor. There was my stout lady, like a faithful watchdog, at the bottom of the ladder, while the young German surgeon, white with anger, was endeavouring to come up it. Several of the German soldiers who had recovered from their prostration were sitting about on the kitchen floor and watching the quarrel with stolid but attentive faces. The landlord was nowhere to be seen. "There is no liquor there," said the woman. "I do not want liquor. I want hay or straw for these men to lie upon. Why should they lie on the bricks when there is straw overhead?" "There is no straw." "What is up there?" "Empty bottles." "Nothing else?" "No." For a moment it looked as if the surgeon would abandon his intention, but one of the soldiers pointed up to the ceiling. I gathered from what I could understand of his words that he could see the straw sticking out between the planks. In vain the woman protested. Two of the soldiers were able to get upon their feet and to drag her aside, while the young surgeon ran up the ladder, pushed open the trap door, and climbed into the loft. As he swung the door back I slipped behind it, but as luck would have it he shut it again behind him, and there we were left standing face to face. Never have I seen a more astonished young man. "A French officer!" he gasped. "Hush!" said I. "Hush! Not a word above a whisper." I had drawn my sword. "I am not a combatant," he said. "I am a doctor. Why do you threaten me with your sword? I am not armed." "I do not wish to hurt you, but I must protect myself. I am in hiding here." "A spy?" "A spy does not wear such a uniform as this, nor do you find spies on the staff of an army." "I rode by mistake into the heart of this Prussian corps, and I concealed myself here in the hope of escaping when they are past. I will not hurt you if you do not hurt me. But if you do not swear that you will be silent as to my presence, you will never go down alive from this attic." "You can put up your sword, sir," said the surgeon, and I saw a friendly twinkle in his eyes. "I am a Pole by birth, and I have no ill feeling to you or your people. I will do my best for my patients, but I will do no more. Capturing Hussars is not one of the duties of a surgeon. With your permission I will now descend with this truss of hay to make a couch for these poor fellows below." I had intended to exact an oath from him, but it is my experience that if a man will not speak the truth he will not swear the truth, so I said no more. The surgeon opened the trap door, threw out enough hay for his purpose, and then descended the ladder, letting down the door behind him. I watched him anxiously when he rejoined his patients, and so did my good friend the landlady, but he said nothing and busied himself with the needs of his soldiers. By this time I was sure that the last of the army corps was past, and I went to my loophole confident that I should find the coast clear, save perhaps for a few stragglers whom I could disregard. The first corps was indeed past, and I could see the last files of the infantry disappearing into the wood. But you can imagine my disappointment when out of the forest of St. Lambert I saw a second corps emerging, as numerous as the first. There could be no doubt that the whole Prussian army, which we thought we had destroyed at Ligny, was about to throw itself upon our right wing, while Marshal Grouchy had been coaxed away upon some fool's errand. The roar of guns, much nearer than before, told me that the Prussian batteries which had passed me were already in action. Imagine my terrible position! Hour after hour was passing, the sun was sinking toward the west, and yet this cursed inn in which I lay hid was like a little island amid a rushing stream of furious Prussians. It was all important I should reach Marshal Grouchy, and yet I could not show my nose without being made prisoner. You can think how I cursed and tore my hair. How little do we know what is in store for us. Even while I raged against my ill fortune, that same fortune was reserving me for a far higher task than to carry a message to Grouchy. A task which could not have been mine had I not been held tight in that little inn on the edge of the forest of Paris. 2 Russian corps had passed and a third was coming up when I heard a great fuss and the sound of several voices in the sitting room. By altering my position I was able to look down and see what was going on. End of section 18.